In youth, naivety and an insatiable urge to experience perhaps life's most rewarding and exciting ventures, such as world travel, romance, career development, and parenthood, can often result in impulsive hastiness and an extreme lack of judgment, which for some could lead to risky behaviors and unpleasant situations that morph into lessons of guidance to aid in steering their futures in hopefully positive and meaningful directions. For others, however, these youthful actions become more than mere life lessons. Rather, they come to haunt their adulthoods and forever alter the trajectory of their lives as well as the lives of those closest to them. For 23-year-old Rie Fujii, juggling academia, newfound motherhood, a turbulent romance, and assimilation to life abroad demonstrated to be a traumatic and life-altering decision, which ultimately led to a fatal mistake that cost two innocent souls their infantile lives. Bienvenue tout le monde, and welcome, fellow true crime fanatics and/or criminal justice scholars, to Coffee, Crime, and Crullers, a video channel exclusively dedicated to the educational examination of Canadian criminal cases conducted by your favorite Canuck and a criminology as well as forensic psychology graduate. My name is DJ, and as your host, my aim is to avoid regurgitating newsworthy crimes and instead, with sufficient and hopefully unbiased research, develop respectful, intellectual, and informative discussions via neutral and fact-based narratives regarding criminal minds, criminal offenses, and the prosecution of federal crimes within the Canadian criminal justice system. All material sources utilized in my videos will always be provided in descriptions below each video, as I believe in full transparency in regards to writing and research. Additionally, please feel free to join the discussion by sharing your thoughts, feelings, knowledge, and/or expertise in the commentaries. If you enjoy the atmosphere and perhaps feel like you would like to follow along, you know the drill. Please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to avoid missing future video postings. Now, with coffee and donut in hand, let's begin the dissection of Coffee, Crime, and Crullers' very first case study. International student Rie Fujii, a Japanese citizen, began her life anew in Canada, in pursuit of fulfilling her lifelong dreams, not unlike many Canadian immigrants, in April of 1997. At 19 years of age, she aspired to formally study the English language, and thus she successfully enrolled in Calgary's Mount Royal College, currently known as Mount Royal University. Initially, she was only permitted to reside in the country on a temporary student visa. Fujii's lone residency in Alberta's capital, however, was short-lived, as approximately a year following her arrival, she commenced a common-law partnership with a young man named Peter Brown. While sources do not specify as to exactly when or how their 4-year-long relationship was established, it is evident that Fujii and Brown were a toxic pair. According to many reports, including those of Fujii herself, as well as those close to the couple, her boyfriend was both physically and emotionally abusive towards her, subsequently causing the eventual termination of their tumultuous relations in the beginning of February in 2001. Despite their difficulties, the duration of their affair produced 2 Canadian-born children. Fujii's and Brown's first child, Domenic Ryu Brown, was born on February 9, 2000, followed by their second-born, Gemini Brown, on February 24, 2001. At the time that Fujii had birthed little Domenic, she had returned to Alberta on a tourist visa following a mandatory leave for Japan, which only lasted a few short months, due to the expiration of her initial student visa. Nevertheless, by early 2000, her subsequent immigration documentation had also expired without extension, and Fujii had ultimately chosen to remain in Canada unlawfully for the next year and a half. This situation left Fujii in a rather difficult and harsh predicament, preventing her from not only enrolling in further post-secondary studies, as well as seeking employment and/or any sort of government-funded financial aid, but more importantly, it negated her ability to protect herself both physically and legally against Brown's continued abuse. Albeit, Fujii had sought support from various women's shelters over the course of her life in Alberta, including a second-stage shelter wherein she was offered a 6-month-long stay for herself and her 2 infants. Fujii ultimately felt as though she was forced to decline the temporary refuge in fear of her potential dependence on Calgary social services eventually revealing her immigration status, leading to her more than likely permanent deportation. On February 4th, 2001, Fujii moved into the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter with baby Domenic. With the exception of 2 weeks, i.e. February 24th to March 10th, 2001, spent under medical observation as a result of the premature delivery of Gemini in, ironically, the same hospital where Fujii would be criminally detained a few months later. Domenic and his mother had called the shelter home during the end of Fujii's second pregnancy. Similarly, from March 17th to April 9th of the same year, Fujii found herself temporarily residing at the Native Women's Shelter in Calgary, whereby her 2 infants were cared for by the Children's Cottage, a 24/7 non-profit crisis nursery which serves as a safe haven for children who require relief from stressful environments while their parents undergo crisis prevention programs and support services. Accounting for the fact that most social service agencies in Canada are funded by federal and provincial governments, non-status individuals, like Fujii had been at the time, are ineligible to access vital services such as legal employment, healthcare, education, settlement services, social housing, rent supplement programs, emergency and short-term shelters, violence against women services, subsidized childcare, child tax benefits, as well as alimony. Additionally, for Fujii, this meant that she was also unable to access appropriate protections from the Canadian justice system concerning Brown's alleged battering. Stated in a letter sent to her parents in Japan while being held in the Peter Loughlin Center's forensic unit under police custody in June of 2001, Fujii admitted, "I have never confided this to anyone, but many times I thought I would rather die. I was happy for the 3 years living together with Peter, but at the same time, it was hard because he kicked and punched me." Apparently, completely unaware of their daughter's personal struggles, Hideo and Tomoklo Fujii were surprised to discover the existence of Fujii's unstable and violent affair with Brown, including the unexpected births of both Domenic and Gemini Brown. "I cried many times," professed Fujii to her parents. "But no matter how abusive Peter became, I tried my best to create a happy family. I tried my best to become a good mother for my babies," she wrote. A Calgary native who was described by his associates as a common criminal with a penchant for drugs, gambling, and stealing, Brown was not only known to local law enforcement due to his extensive criminal history, but according to Brown himself, he had avoided all legal pursuits to gain access to his 2 children in an attempt to avoid police capture, as authorities had sought multiple arrest warrants on his behalf following his and Fujii's breakup in the beginning of 2001. Much like her letter to her Japanese parents, Fujii also wrote a letter to her former boyfriend around the same period regarding her struggles to cope with her role as a young single mother. "I just wanted you to know how hard looking after Dom is," she expressed. While she remained unemployed due to her residential illegitimacy, Fujii explained to Brown that her job as a single mother offered her no days off and no paycheck. Furthermore, according to numerous journal excerpts later obtained by Calgary police, the presumed-to-be overwhelmed Fujii wrote the following: "It's really hard for me to do all the things at the same time. Looking after baby, worried about rent, worrying about buying stuff for the house and the baby, and buying groceries." Briefly after deciding to permanently separate from her children's father, Fujii moved on romantically with a man known as Chris Noller, following her departure from Brown's Calgary apartment with Domenic and Gemini in late March of 2001. From there, she had moved into her own downtown apartment in the city with the 2 infants on April 10th. Her new flame, Noller, was reported to have moved into this apartment with her and the children for a few days prior to eventually settling in with his father in the township of Cochrane, approximately 40 kilometers, or an estimated 30 to 40-minute drive outside of the city limits of Calgary. Perhaps feeling as though she had definitively found a suitable mate and required much-needed relief from her motherly duties as a single parent under the tremendous stress of ongoing financial and housing insecurities, Fujii began to spend the majority of her personal time with her new boyfriend, allegedly leaving Domenic and Gemini unattended at home more frequently, at times even overnight, between mid-April and mid-May. In stark contrast to her journal entries from September 2000, which painted Fujii to have been a doting and energetic new mother, Fujii's state of mind in the spring of 2001 seemed to have reverted back to that of one which resembled her previous childless self. From entries such as, "Domenic is so cute all the time. We played a lot today. I think Dom is enjoying staying here with me too," to briefly prior to committing acts which could be described by many as crimes against nature, Fujii wrote, "I hate my stupid living. I've decided to live like I used to." Whether it was a longing for a life of sex and drugs, as a prison police informant would later declare, that would be Fujii's motive behind her behavior towards her 2 children, or a desired life without the overbearing burden of having to raise multiple infants with little to no support, 23-year-old Fujii began neglecting the well-being of 15-month-old Domenic and 3-month-old Gemini until their shared tragic demise at the end of May 2001. Shortly prior to their deaths, a contact of Brown's who claimed to have run into Fujii on public transit asserted that she had confided to him how much she had hated her life with Brown and their children. He claimed that she had so much hate for the trio that she had desired to kill all 3 of them. This statement did not seem to be corroborated by any additional sources at the time, i.e. by neither media outlets nor by any known associates of Fujii's or Brown's. Whilst Fujii had initiated neglecting Domenic and Gemini from April, during Noller's residency near the Chinook Shopping Center in Calgary, it was not until Noller had moved farther away to Cochrane that the pair of infants were eventually starved of food, attention, and basic care. Unfortunately, due to this neglect for what would reportedly occur for a consecutive week and a half, or an enduring period of approximately 10 days, Domenic and Gemini were discovered to be physically unresponsive and soon after determined to be deceased in the words of their absentee mother, upon her return to their home on May 18, 2001. With only a bottle of formula left for each infant by their mother to physically sustain them during her absence, both Domenic and Gemini were deemed by authorities to have most likely succumbed to starvation and dehydration at some point during their abandonment. What arguably makes this case even more chilling, perhaps, is the fact that according to Fujii herself, instead of informing authorities, or anyone else for that matter, of her children's passing, she simply wrapped her son's corpse in a blanket, leaving him on the floor of their apartment, while she covered her daughter's remains in plastic garbage bags, which she initially told Calgary police investigators to have disposed of in a nearby dumpster. Contrarily, she retracted the statement shortly thereafter and admitted to have discarded Gemini's lifeless body in a local river known as the Bow River, located near Prince's Island Park in downtown Calgary. Having presumably dealt with her losses, Fujii resumed her life, including her plans with Noller in Cochrane, 2 days later, as though her children were never a part of it. Fujii's revised admission of the location of Gemini's remains led the Calgary police to execute dive-and-search efforts across the Bow River for an extension of several weeks, to which, dreadfully, there was no avail. According to Fujii's estranged former lover and the father of her children, Brown had apparently attempted to reconcile with her, as well as reunite with his children during their separation, involving an incident wherein he had physically approached Fujii in April of 2001. During this confrontation, Brown had allegedly forcibly endeavored to reclaim his ex-girlfriend upon spotting Fujii with Noller, thereby professing his love for her and aiming to persuade her to leave Noller and re-establish their romance. Fujii nonetheless rejected Brown's advances at the time, preventing any further contact between the two, as well as any future encounters with his young children. Regardless of his repeated efforts to see Domenic and Gemini, as reported by Brown to interviewers, Fujii and her friends had refused to inform him of their whereabouts. It was not until Fujii had been apprehended by Calgary police that Brown had learned of his family's circumstances. "This is a tragic event in my life," Brown mentioned in a Global News report. "They knew where she was and wouldn't tell me where she was, and now this has happened. From what I've heard," he added, "she left my son and took off to Cochrane and partied for 4 days straight and left my son alone in that apartment." At the time of this statement release, Fujii had turned herself into authorities post a police warrant being issued for her arrest following the discovery of Domenic's corpse. More specifically, 5 days had elapsed since Domenic's decomposing body was accidentally uncovered by Pritpal Sandhu, the owner of Fujii's rental unit, on June 5, 2001. Sandhu had reported to have entered the seemingly vacant apartment in order to deliver a written eviction notice in response to Fujii's failure to make payments for rent. Yet, to Sandhu's horror, he stated to have detected an extremely foul odor emitting from the unit at the moment of entry, forcing him to walk the premises further, only to reveal the decaying remains of a male infant. Law enforcement had been immediately notified, and once the deceased infant was identified as Domenic Brown, his mother was promptly charged with failing to bury a human corpse by homicide investigators, to which Fujii had surrendered the following day on June the 6th. Upon learning of Gemini's death, detectives hastily implemented a search of the Bow River in hopes of retrieving the second infant's remains. According to an article released by the Calgary Herald on June 8th, elevated water levels in the Bow River had hampered divers' efforts, and several days of searching had not resulted in any related discoveries. "The river's still high and murky, and we'll wait until it subsides and clears up, and then we'll search again," stated the late Staff Sergeant George Rocks of the Calgary Police Homicide Unit. On August 14, 2001, over 2 months after Fujii was arrested for her son's death, she was additionally charged with her daughter's murder when law enforcement officially presumed Gemini Brown to be deceased by absentia. Although she initially faced 2 counts of second-degree murder, Fujii instead pled guilty to a manslaughter charge concerning Domenic's passing, and consequently, she received an 8-year sentence solely for this single-count charge. No trial was ever deployed, and after serving 5 years of her 8-year penalty in the Edmonton Institute for Women, Fujii was expeditiously deported back to her native country due to the breach of her immigration status in Canada. Since no additional charges were ever filed against Fujii, she had received a total of 5 years imprisonment after a Calgary court judge awarded her 30 months credit for time already served. The imposing judge granted Fujii this 2-for-1 credit for the 15 months of pre-disposition custody, where she was kept in solitary confinement as a result of her fear for her safety from potential harm of other inmates. Notwithstanding a seemingly short prison sentence, it is important to keep in mind that within the Canadian criminal justice system, a conviction of manslaughter, i.e., a criminal offense involving unlawful homicide without premeditation and/or intent, is a less serious offense than first-degree and second-degree murder, and therefore permits a far lighter sentence and can occur in various circumstances. This includes cases wherein an accused is engaged in lawful activity, howbeit he or she is reckless and/or negligent in the death of another person or persons. Moreover, manslaughter can also take place in cases of criminal negligence, whereby similarly, an accused's actions display a wanton and/or reckless disregard for others' safety, resulting in their death or deaths. In order for one to be convicted of manslaughter, the Crown, i.e., the provincial prosecutor, must sufficiently demonstrate that the accused, without reasonable doubt, A. caused the death of the victim or victims, and B. that their actions were a significant contributing factor in the death or deaths of their victim or victims. Likewise, the burden of proof is also placed on the Crown in regards to the existence of a mens rea, i.e., the guilty mind of a perpetrator, for the execution of a successful manslaughter conviction against the accused. Unlike in the United States, and perhaps in other foreign countries, manslaughter does not carry a minimum sentence for convicted offenders, i.e., unless committed with the use of a firearm, which translates to a 4-year minimum penalty. In this case, specific sentencing is determined solely by a trial judge, and this sentence is based on numerous factors, including an offender's degree of culpability, a potential presence of aggravating and/or mitigating factors, as well as an offender's potential prior criminal history. Aggravating factors may lead to harsher sentences, comprising of the use of a weapon, the presence of a prior criminal record, and the vulnerability of the victim or victims involved. Mitigating factors, on the other hand, may lead to leniency in sentencing for perpetrators accused of manslaughter due to offenders' potential remorse, their lack of prior criminal history, as well as offenders' mental health or state of mind during their commission of such offenses. The maximum penalty for manslaughter in Canada, conversely, is lifelong imprisonment. The severity of this penalty is intended to serve as a deterrent to others and as a means of protection for greater Canadian society against dangerous offenders. This type of sentence naturally reflects the gravity of such a crime, including the direct cause of another's death. This means that the degree of an accused's intent, the presence of aggravating and/or mitigating factors, and the accused's previous criminal history, if present, may all be considered for formal sentencing. When Canadian offenders receive life sentences, this translates to mandatory imprisonment for 25 years prior to any possibility of eligibility for parole. Thus, while a sentenced offender will most likely not spend the remainder of their life in prison, as this is a rare circumstance, i.e., unless an offender is geriatric at the time of sentencing and/or commission of said offense, they will, however, remain under the jurisdiction of the Correctional Service of Canada, or the CSC, for their foreseeable future. Similarly, this type of perpetrator may be granted parole, that is, including early parole due to so-called good behavior, and/or they may be re-imprisoned should they choose to violate the conditions of their parole, for instance, committing additional crimes thereafter. As for Rie Fujii, in spite of her attempts to request early release, the Parole Board of Canada, or the PBC, denied her application for parole in June of 2004, less than 2 years following her conviction. In summary, within the complexities of the Canadian criminal justice system, multiple sentencing considerations are taken into account, such as an offender's degree of culpability of the crime or crimes in question, potential criminal history, remorse and willingness to accept responsibility for their crime or crimes, impact of the crime or crimes, i.e. emotional and/or financial impact on the victim or victims and the community at large, prospect of offender rehabilitation, as well as other relevant factors. For instance, the presence of additional crimes committed, such as sexual assault or the use of firearms. It is also crucial to note that it is regular practice for Canadian trial judges and/or Crown prosecutors to pursue sentencing based on the most serious of offenses in criminal cases involving multiple charges laid against perpetrators, as opposed to seeking convictions for various other charges should they exist related to the same crimes. This can result in harsher penalties for a single criminal offense, while other less relatable and less severe charges may be dismissed altogether. For instance, in Fujii's case, her initial criminal charge of failing to bury Domenic's corpse had been disregarded. Having concluded the dissection of Ms. Rie Fujii's criminal case study and accounting for all vital and related legal considerations of her crimes, such as aggravating and mitigating factors, and the lack of a criminal past, for instance, at least within her host country, as well as associated penalties, do you believe that Domenic and Gemini received justice for their senseless deaths? How about Peter Brown? Did Fujii's sentence and/or overall consequences sufficiently reflect the seriousness of her crimes in Canada? Did her penalty act to deter potential future offenders, including other foreigners, from committing similar crimes? Let's talk about it. The comment section below is now open for discussion. Also, please don't hesitate to express your personal thoughts, opinions, and/or experiences regarding this particular case study, or even my rendition of it. All related commentary is much appreciated. Thank you for joining me on this premiere episode of Coffee, Crime, and Crullers. May your coffee be strong, your donut real sweet, and your criminological mind smart as a whip.